Episode 1 of Series 2 of Primeval opens with a rare weeknight of fun, as the Castle Cross Bowlerama is in full swing at maximum capacity. But behind the pin shuffling machine, an anomaly opens. As one of the balls goes through, it rolls down a rocky hill on the other side, overlooking a barren Mesozoic escarpment, as a forever familiar reptilian foot lands beside it, Halux talon in the shape of a signature sickle. The episode then picks up right where Series 1 left off, and the anomaly is closing. In Series 1, we saw the group first discover the rips in space and time known as anomalies, and deal with the creatures that came through them, like carnivorous gorgonopsids, giant invertebrates, and aquatic mosasaurs. There were fatalities, and on a personal level too, as one of Connor's friends was killed by a parasite transmitted by a dodo. Nick's wife Helen had also been living in the past for years, and shows up to both help save them from a swarm of pterosaurs, but also brings a giant, parentally enraged, carnivorous future ground bat to the party too. Past, present, and future collide in the final episode. As the secrets of Helen's infidelity with Stephen come out, Nick and Claudia confess their love, and the gorgonopsid and future predator face off in a bloody brawl over the latter's devoured young, that sees the ancient stem mammal victorious, though 2 of the pups survive. Nick desperately tries to get back through to set things right, as he says, but Stephen and Connor restrain him. As Cutter tries to talk to Lester about Claudia, he finds out she's been replaced with someone completely different, and that they moved from the home office weeks ago. To the concern of his team, Nick collapses in the middle of a panic attack, as it hits him just how different things are now. And, with nothing else he can do, Nick sedately joins the others in the vehicle. Back at Castle Cross, security go on a raptor hunt after they find signs of life after hours in the Bowlerama. Neither make it out alive, as one is killed behind the pin machines, and the other is eaten alive in the shopping centre. Returning to the Ark, Cutter is bewildered by the structure, and is greeted by people he doesn't know, whereas everyone else easily slips into their work routines. He meets Claudia's replacement, Oliver League, and after a confused start, Cutter quickly decides to play along, although the interaction doesn't go unnoticed by Connor. They get called back out for another creature report in Castle Cross, and Connor approaches Nick. Connor's love of sci-fi concepts finally comes in clutch for their relationship, as he's willing to believe Nick on his timeline shift notion, and Cutter finally has the relief of at least one person who still fully trusts and believes him. It seems no matter what happens in the timeline, Connor will still be Connor.
Is that a bad or a good thing?
As they arrive at Castle Cross and begin loading up, Connor starts his arc of demanding a tranquilizer gun to deal with creatures, only to be fairly shot down by Abby and Stephen on his complete lack of experience. They get a brief false alarm as the duty manager lets them in, and Cutter demands that the shopping centre be sealed behind them. Stephen is feeling brave, and decides to approach Nick about everything that went down in the Forest of Dean, especially vis-a-vis the whole sleeping with his wife thing. Cutter briskly dismisses things and says he's over it, telling Stephen to forget it, though no one is really convinced. In the security office, they get their first glimpse of the creature on the cameras, and are morbidly delighted to find they have both their first dinosaur, and to have it be an adult dromaeosaur. Then behind the pin machines, they find the anomaly. As Abby reprimands Connor for burgling a slush puppy machine, we get our first look at the creature too. It's a large dromaeosaur, although it's hard to say what type exactly. Tall enough to look a man in the eye, it's too large for Deinonychus, but it's also too small and slight to be the mountainous Utahraptor of Walking With fame either. Perhaps the most likely culprit is a Kilobatter, a large Mongolian dromaeosaur that apparently lived in more arid areas, that could match with the barren highland landscape of the opening, even if the lower lying areas were likely more well watered. After gagging on some pinballs, it decides to go for Connor instead, as Abby seals the shutters. Luckily, rubber soles beat reptilian talons on the 21st century smooth flooring, and Connor escapes. Despite their Spielbergian reputation, dromaeosaurs weren't built for speed, nor were especially fast, although larger ones may well have been fast enough to catch people. Connor likely benefited a lot more from the slippery human architecture. Shame about the brain freeze. Stephen wants more firepower to deal with the dinosaur, but Nick isn't budging on using tranquilizers only, and after losing Claudia is ironclad in this rule, despite Stephen's pushing. They have another jump scare with their cleaner working late, and then check in with Lester at the Ark and have him shut down the shopping centre and prepare armed backup. The Ministry want Lester to have a public response person to help them cover up anomalies, and after initially scoffing, Lester wonders how exactly he's going to cover up a dinosaur in a shopping centre, and so decides it might be a good idea. Nick and Stephen follow the raptor to Laser Quest, and it pounces on Stephen, who just had a piece of the set to shield himself. The tranq rifle jams, and we see this is true, but Stephen is skeptical and believes Nick was leaving him to the raptor. Abby and Connor escort the cleaner to get the things from his lockers, and despite Connor's A-team routine to check if the coast is clear, the cleaner is fatally mauled by a baby dromaeosaur in his locker. Connor then tranquilizes Abby by mistake, but also takes down the baby too. In John Lewis, Stephen confronts Nick about the Laser Quest incident, and again Nick blows him off, saying that if he really wanted Stephen dead, he'd just shoot him himself. The adult pursues the two of them, and Stephen realizes Nick was actually being honest with him when the gun jams. He still manages to tranquilize the adult anyway. The two then reconcile over the sleeping dinosaur, with Stephen apologizing for his pretty extreme accusations. Nick tells him the important thing was that he decided to stay and not go with Helen, and that's all that matters. But both are pretty certain Helen isn't finished with them, as she never did handle rejection especially well. They put everyone tranquilized in the bowling alley for the pending dinosaur release, and realize there's still another adult dromaeosaur active in the shopping centre. After a sprint back to Abby, Nick suggests it could be a nuclear family of 2 parents and a chick that came through, and they attempt to use the youngster as bait. What is presumably the adult male now shows up, with blue eye patches and quills that's really giving Walking with Dinosaurs ornitholestes. To the surprise of everyone, upon finding the chick, the male quickly kills and eats it. Initially popularized by Jurassic Park, the idea of pack-hunting dromaeosaurs is a popular one with little real support. It's far from impossible, especially with the diversity of social structures and foraging seen in modern carnivores, and modern birds of prey too, but with some, like Deinonychus, the subadults had been found to eat different food from the adults, that would likely suggest they weren't living in a social unit. This doesn't completely negate parental care, and new chicks may well have been attended to by the parents for a certain time or until a certain size, at which point they were on their own, with the paper making analogues to ratites or modern raptors. But for Primeval's dromaeosaurs, it's also just possible this chick wasn't fathered by the male, so down the hatch it goes. Abby then wakes up, and the dromaeosaur quickly zeroes in on the potential of a mammalian main course, but is driven into a feral rage by the blue lights on one of the games machines. Tim Haynes and Adrian Hodges mention a cut point of the script that the male dromaeosaur went berserk on seeing the colour blue, due to the colour of their eye crests, and this being a competitive signal for them. After this incident, an irate Stephen goes to get a bigger gun without asking Nick. The dam of stress and worry in Nick's mind finally bursts, and he explains to Stephen how it's not just Claudia Brown, and how everything is different now, that they can't just afford another change like that. The showrunners say in the commentary that this is a key moment to show it is just bigger than Claudia, and Adrian Hodges also says in an interview, originally more people than Claudia had been changed by Helen's actions, but they ran out of time to show this. The alarm is set off, and Cutter and Stephen find the local youth riding their dirt bikes around the car park. A dirt bike chase ensues as they try to lead the male back into the shopping centre, and Connor saves the day by tranquilizing it in the nick of time. The team prepare to send the dinosaurs home, and Abby and Cutter get an Alan Grant moment as the former remarks how bird-like the dromaeosaur skeleton feels like. Cutter then takes Connor to John Lewis and tells him to tune all the radios to 87.6 FM, a frequency that seems to be picking up interference caused by the anomaly. Nick also tells Connor if he doesn't make it back, it's down to him now. Abby asks Cutter what Claudia was like, and he starts in usual Cutter fashion by saying she was okay, before eventually loosening up and making it clear that he loved her. Abby wants to believe Nick, but can't quite bring herself to do so yet. Cutter takes the dinosaurs back home. After one look at the anomaly, he heads into the Cretaceous alone, with the naive idea he can put things back to the way they were. Stephen followed him through, and confronts him on the unlikeliness of this happening, or that he could make things worse. Surprisingly, he convinces the stubborn Cutter, and the two race back as the anomaly starts to close. The male raptor chases them in hot pursuit, grabbing Stephen's ankle, with a tug-of-war occurring between the past and present. The question of what happens if an anomaly closes on you is finally answered, and the male's head is perfectly severed from the body. Cutter is right too. All the radios are now back to normal, with the anomaly closed. Lester summons the whole team back to meet their new PR wizard, mentioned earlier in the episode. She introduces herself as Jenny Lewis, and Cutter is delighted, as she looks identical to Claudia Brown. For episode 2's opening, we meet Helen again. She's busy going full House Atreides in the late Cretaceous, with a new haircut and new outfit, and gets struck by a pteranodon as she raids its nest, wounding her leg. Back at the Ark, we find out Jenny's introduction didn't go especially well. Cutter did not make a good first impression, and tries to convince her that she's actually Claudia Brown. Again, Connor provides Cutter's salvation, and pulls him aside for a quick chat to ground him in reality after the shock. Jenny is briefed by Lester, and she's pretty skeptical of her role, and that they'll actually be fighting dinosaurs. Half right, as they've only just had the first true dinosaurs in the series a few hours ago. Meanwhile, on the set of The Apprentice, things quickly go askew as a high-powered business meeting is interrupted by an anomaly. One that quickly begins to leak a dense anoxic fog into the building. The fog isn't the only threat, and a maintenance man is dragged in by a hidden beast. As a fire team arrives, they find the anomaly, and the chief quickly suffers the same fate as the maintenance man. Cutter is pitching the anomaly detector to Lester, and Leek is all for it. Lester agrees and has Leek supervise the project. Connor and Abby are picking films to watch, and Abby leaves Connor in charge of entertainment for the night. As he idles, a woman named Caroline strikes up a conversation, playing Connor like a fiddle as she asks for his sci-fi and fantasy recommendations. Connor makes the interesting decision of then bringing her back to Abby's apartment, and Rex doesn't take a shine to her. Before things can get too awkward, they get dragged back to work due to a new anomaly, but Connor does get her number. At Stephen's apartment, Helen has dragged herself to his bathroom, and as he returns, she starts her broken bird performance. Right now at least, Stephen holds his ground, and brushes off her advances after she blew his little secret. However, they do then sleep together, and Helen needles Stephen as he responds to the creature sighting too. Everyone shows up to the offices, and Cutter makes an equally bad second impression on Jenny, who is still unconvinced of their job description. He and Stephen enter the building, and upon smelling the gases, Cutter concludes the anomaly is likely Precambrian. They find the surviving firefighter, and also the monsters of the week, giant worm-like creatures with petal-like mouths and tough bodily sheaths. As they help the firefighter out of it, one of the worms pursues them, but quickly dies outside the fog, with the oxygen being toxic to it. As she makes it out, the firefighter meets Jenny, and only piques her curiosity further. Nick and Stephen realize without a fire, the lifts should still be fine, but a worm has already gotten trapped in it, and the two are separated. At the Ark, Connor and Abby try to come up with a way to clear the fog. As they decide on leaf blowers, Connor sees the cleaner who was mauled by the dromaeosaur chick in the shopping centre, now dressed as a soldier. He brushes off Connor, and Abby hurries him to get to the anomaly, but clearly something is going on. Stephen makes his way to the lifts, and flees inside the shaft from the worms. Jenny rings Nick and loses her patience, demanding to know what's going on. Cutter agrees to tell her, but she decides to take the lifts despite what Nick said, and now Stephen has to pretty hastily climb for his life. Not long after stepping off, Jenny is attacked by a worm, and Nick beheads it with a display sword, with Jenny repaying the favour moments later, and the two start arguing. Jenny realises everything she was told earlier was true, and has some difficulty grappling with this fact. Abby and Connor show up, and they go to try and find Stephen and the trapped office workers. They successfully get the latter out, and it turns out they nailed their presentation too. And Connor is almost eaten along the way, losing Caroline's number. On the ground level, Jenny brushes off the questions of the office workers. She is right, that they'd sound insane if they tried to tell anyone, and it is for their own good. But Nick notices the stark contrast between Jenny's tough love and Claudia's compassion for the victims of the creatures. Nick, Abby and Connor form a plan to turn up the temperature, so the fog will be pushed out by the ventilation system, and Cutter resumes his search for Stephen, with Jenny joining him. On the walk up, Cutter surprisingly fills her in on the whole thing with Helen and Stephen, and whilst she advocates for playing it safe for backup to arrive, Cutter refuses to leave Stephen up there. Connor and Abby's mission is successful, and sulphurous gas is vented from the building. Nick and Jenny find Stephen, and the worms start behaving weirdly. From either the oxygen, heat, or both, they swell up and violently burst, spraying viscera and their offspring over the three. After frantically pulling the worms off, Nick activates the sprinklers, with the cold water killing the young. The worms are weird, very weird. As so much of what they do suggests they aren't from the Precambrian, they readily lunge for large endothermic life forms that won't exist for millions of years. And the spawning can be rationalized with their huge size. As large-bodied ectotherms, they'd likely fail to control their body temperatures, so they spawn instead to bring out their small offspring that are less likely to overheat. If there are seasonal changes, it's hard to imagine this happens every warm season, and that such ectotherms can grow to the size of pigs in a year, and that Precambrian ecosystems had sufficient nutrients to facilitate that. So presumably it's a sporadic event with certain heat waves. The exploding would draw in scavengers that the offspring could theoretically parasitize, but again it's Precambrian. It may be possible they weren't looking for a new host, as Nick says, but rather they instinctively burrow on birth to avoid either the heat or cannibalistic adults. It's a shame there's no commentary for episode 2, as it'd be good to know what exactly they had in mind with the worms. Outside, Nick and Stephen talk about the anomalies, and how they handle them. Stephen believes people should know about the anomalies, and maybe they should be treated as natural phenomena, rather than something to combat. Nick argues they should try to keep the natural order, but Stephen replies how can they even tell that, when the anomalies play such havoc with evolution and what the natural order is. Everyone heads home after work. Stephen finds his apartment empty, and Caroline interrupts Connor and Abby's downtime, with Connor running off for a drink with Caroline. Nick goes to Jenny's house, taking a look at his only picture of Claudia, before attempting a speech to explain what went on to Jenny, now that she knows what the anomalies are. Jenny's fiancé shows up though, and a dejected Cutter leaves, as Helen watches nearby. The loss or change of certain people is a pretty common theme in time travel media. Probably the most famous is in Back to the Future, where Marty starts to fade if his parents don't get together, and where Biff the Bully becomes a billionaire from knowing what sports teams to bet on. In Primeval's contemporary Doctor Who, a similar event occurs in a parallel world, where Rose's father didn't die in her infancy, and managed to become a successful businessman, leading to her mum Jackie to become a different and far worse person who also never had Rose. Mickey also gets a lot cooler too, but he does get killed by a Cyberman. The most Primevalish example is A Sound of Thunder, where an organisation has developed technology similar to the anomalies, or Prehistoric Park's time portals, for the purpose of hunting safaris. In a T-Rex hunt, someone steps on a butterfly, and upon returning to the present day, they find a fascist dictator has won the recent election. It also got a terrible film adaptation, that featured speculative baboon lizards, and either may have been a big inspiration for events in Primeval. Creator Tim Haynes says that Helen purposefully mucked up Cutter's timeline after the events of the Season 1 finale, so the change of Claudia Brown into Jenny Lewis seems to be a deliberate act from Helen stepping on the right butterfly. In Episode 3, we open with a game of paintball, and also a blatant disregard for the safety rules of paintball, as someone shoots their friends without masks on. He's quickly and violently killed for this indiscretion as the credits roll. Connor has to blow off another date with Caroline, who sends a picture of Rex to an unknown number as he leaves. The reason for his disappearance is to show off the new anomaly detection device, showing off the portable and fixed version, which functions by monitoring all the radio transmitters in the UK for anomaly-induced variations. Leek and Jenny both scoff at the device, especially when Leek gets a call about a possible new creature attack. It turns out to be the man from the opening, and at Thorpe Park, or rather Blue Sky Park. An investigation of the body strongly suggests an attack from a large carnivoran, and likely a large felid, with prominent claw marks and partial consumption too. Connor is dismayed that his detector isn't working, but Abby and Stephen come to his aid with the suggestion it may not be an anomaly, and plenty extant species could do that damage as well. Albeit an escaped pantherine is still not exactly good news. As Helen slides into Stephen's DMs, Jenny and Nick speak with Valerie, the deputy park manager. Her regional manager, Peter, is not keen to close the park in the middle of summer, but with Jenny they manage to haggle to closing the paintballing area, making the argument a media meltdown from closing the park would be too much to handle. Nick is right to be worried though, and in the picnic area we catch our first glimpse of the beast. Stephen finds tracks, and Abby and Cutter follow up as Connor is left to oversee the park and text Caroline, ignoring the sure sign of an insane mind as she texts in all caps. Connor sees something in the bushes and hears the screams of the public. He takes action, grabbing Stephen's big gun and taking a shot into the bushes. It turns out to be Peter again, in a lion costume, who luckily isn't hurt. Jenny manages to smooth things over, and Connor isn't in as much trouble as he fears. A lead to a farm nearby finds the landowner was busted some time ago for illegally importing lion cubs for a private zoo, and the team follow up. Nick and Jenny attempt their own ways at trying to bust him, but it turns out he is clean, with nothing but dogs on his farm. Nick and Jenny do also seem to be warming to one another. The field team stay out at night, and go full Tom Clancy with their night vision goggles. Stephen bumps into Valerie, who is having car trouble. Giving her a lift back, she seems pretty curious about what's going on, and the creature especially, and Stephen's vague question dodging doesn't help. Peter arrives at the train station, and is seemingly being stalked by something. He attempts to barricade himself in the station, but the creature's identity is finally uncovered, as we see an impressive male smileodon give pursuit. Peter is quickly taken down, with a nearby train spotter capturing the entire event. Stephen goes after it, but breaks off the chase to escort Valerie away. Jenny, Nick, and Connor arrive and identify the beast, as Jenny sweet-talks the train spotter into silence, to Nick's bewilderment. The next morning, the team prepare their campaign to capture the Smileodon, and Valerie seems upset at what they're doing, despite the mounting death toll. As they dig pitfalls, Cutter sees a body, but then has greater concerns as the cat arrives ahead of schedule and attacks the group. A specialized killer of Pleistocene megafauna, the Smileodon readily squares up to Abby's digger, but soon realizes it may have bitten off a bit more than it can chew, and goes for Nick instead, who escapes via zipline and Abby startling it with a gunshot. They return to examine the body, and Connor is relieved to find it's at least a month old. With the extreme damage matching that of the paintballer at the start, the anomaly detector is still working fine it seems. But Nick raises the greater concern, that for some reason, someone is covering for the Smileodon. Leek believes it to be the farmer from earlier, with the history of big cat trafficking, and says that Jenny has already gone to meet with him, needing a cover story for Peter's fate. Jenny is essentially trying to blackmail him, believing the dogs to be for fighting, and so using that as leverage to force him to accept the escaped line cover story, rather than paying him off or anything. The farmer snaps and pulls a gun on Jenny, and genuinely seems to be about to murder her until Stephen, Connor and Abby show up to save the day. But he has genuinely no idea about the smileodon. At the dig, Nick uncovers the wallet of the first victim, and it turns out to be Valerie's partner. The scene then confirms this as it cuts to Valerie feeding her prehistoric, bear-sized house cat. Nick goes to try and speak with Valerie, and finds pictures of her with the cat when it was just a small cub. He calls the others, and they come to join proceedings, but Valerie cuts them off en route and Stephen gives pursuit. Unfortunately, it turns out to be an innocent mechanic. Back at her house, Valerie then catches Cutter unawares and at gunpoint. She's adamant they've created the smileodon in some Jurassic Park-esque gene experiment, and then they abandoned him as a runt. She explains how she found him in her garage one morning, alone and half dead. Presumably the cub was already lost or abandoned, and wandered through a relatively short-term anomaly before it closed. Maybe a terror bird chased him through. An emotional Valerie refuses to part with him, believing the cat will be subject to torture and experiments, and plans to expose Nick as the tyrannical scientists she thinks they are. She's beyond negotiating, and leaves Nick with the approaching smileodon. Nick is pursued through the house, as he improvises a desperate defense from various household items. Dropping from an upstairs balcony, he injures his ankle, and grabs a pitchfork for a desperate last stand. Valerie now tries to intervene, albeit on behalf of the smileodon, but the frustrated and hungry cat turns on her instead, fatally mauling her in an instant, as Stephen arrives and tranquilizes it. He brings up the point he made at the end of the last episode too, believing casualties like this stem from public ignorance of the anomalies, and wishes he'd told her what was really going on. He does have a point in this incident at least. If Valerie didn't think Cutter was to blame, she never would have tried to Carol Baskin him, and the whole incident could have been avoided. Back at the Ark, Leek tells Cutter the Smilodon died of a stress-induced heart attack, en route to the base, and doesn't endear himself any further to Cutter when he tries to suggest it was Abby's fault, and that the body has already been destroyed. Connor's detector gets its maiden voyage, and he has to blow off Caroline again for an unsympathetic Cutter and Jenny. We then find out Leek has gone to meet with Caroline, and whatever she's doing for him is getting her paid handsomely, but she's still relatively in the dark. Episode 4 opens with a local youth playing basketball. Lucian fumbles and goes to collect the ball from a flooded drain, attracting the attention of something in the water, which quickly drags him under. At the Ark, Connor's detector picks up the incursion, narrowing it down to the river before it closes, but Leek is furious it didn't get the correct coordinates. At their flat, Caroline switches off Connor's phone so they don't get notified, before making lunch and giving some unsolicited martial arts advice to Abby, until she points out Cutter's calls and that Connor's been missing. The two leave in a hurry, and Leek is irritated she didn't stall them further. As Rex ruins the table she set, it becomes clear Caroline focuses her ire on him now. At the manhole cover, Nick and Stephen enter to explore, and hear peculiar whale-like singing in the brickwork. They hear something moving, and rush to find it, only for whatever it is to submerge and head to the canal. In the shadows, the cleaner-turned-soldier watches. At the canal, Abby jabs Connor for how things are going with Caroline, and he gets defensive. Before things can escalate, Nick and Stephen show up, and they dispatch boats to try and find the creature. Day turns to night, and Cutter's boat finds skin from what seems to be a marine mammal. This isn't such a surprise. The Thames has seals that live in it, and in 2006 there was the first whale that swam up it too, a common bottlenose, with a beluga in 2018 and a minke in 2021, although only the beluga survived its ordeal. On Jenny's boat, Abby claims to spot something, but it quickly turns into an argument between Connor and Abby. Jenny gets them both to shut up, and goes to take the spotlight from them, when something knocks the boat and she falls in. Near instantly, a signature triangular dorsal fin emerges, and makes a beeline straight for Jenny, who somehow can't swim. Things are getting tense until Cutter's boat pulls up. He helps Jenny out, and Stephen guns down the shark. As they return to the docks and head in for the night, a peculiar mammalian face appears from the water for a glance, before sinking back into the canal. Back at the Ark, Cutter approaches Jenny to see how she's doing, and Jenny admits what a fish out of water she is compared to the rest of them, in more ways than one. Unlike Claudia, she's a newcomer to the whole anomaly situation, but the different person she's become still has some similarities to Claudia. Nick points out she doesn't have to continue, or even go into the field, yet Jenny is still courageous enough to take her chances, as she puts it. The two chat about romantic prospects too, and we find out that whilst Cutter told her about Helen and Stephen, he never actually fully explained the whole thing with Claudia. This time though, he decides to leave it, and goes to dissect the shark. We now get a good look at it, and it's a large specimen, around the same size as a great white. Despite the spine in front reminiscent of Hybodus, the prehistoric shark mentioned by Tim Haynes in the commentary that fulfilled that niche in the Walking With series, Nick deduces it's from the future, when he pulls out a long, tri-tipped tongue covered in teeth. It's fair to say sharks aren't doing too well due to human actions, and rather than being something newly evolved, the spine could be a vestigial holdover from its small ancestors. Large megafaunal sharks are in steep decline, and should they go extinct in a pessimistic but not impossible version of our future, then smaller ones like dogfish species may inherit the future oceans. Some dogfish and related sharks like spur dogs have defensive spines in similar places, so even if it takes a while, maybe the primeval shark is elasmobranchs reclaiming the oceans as megafauna after humanity's destruction. The tooth-laden tongue is weird, but also not out of bounds for sharks. Shark skin is covered in denticles, structures more like teeth than our skin, and it could well repurpose some of these to form actual teeth on the tongue to grab prey. The bigger question is why a fast and active shark would ever need a harpoon tongue. Maybe the individual in the canal was starving, and so became a more active hunter, and they normally hide in the benthos and ambush prey, or perhaps usually take tricky prey tackled at arm's reach. But, luckily from the dissection, no people. The shark's stomach is empty, so whilst it's one problem down, they still don't know what abducted Lucian. As Cutter and Stephen report to Lester, Stephen oddly pushes for the notion that whatever else is out there is most likely another of the same species of shark, whereas Cutter is much less convinced, believing it could be a marine mammal or similar organism that could leave the canal for other water bodies, and that they should widen the search. Lester goes with Stephen's easier option though, and keeps the search limited to the canal. As Abby and Connor get back, Caroline is still in their flat, and Abby finds Rex suffering in the fridge. As they rush to save him, Caroline gets in the way, and Abby is pretty keen for her to leave. Connor doesn't understand when to pick his battles, and tries to mount a defense, but is quickly shut down. In the morning, Stephen and Cutter resume their search in the canal. Cutter goes off to explore, and sees the cleaner/security guard, and a chase ensues. When Cutter corners him on the boat, the cleaner punches him out cold. As he comes to, Nick once again hears the peculiar singing on the other side of the boat, and gets a mic to listen to it in the water. He and Connor discuss the mysterious cleaner, and conclude they're being watched. Connor and Abby start kicking off again, and now it's Nick's turn to tell them to pipe down, as they record the singing and play it back in the canal to see if they can draw the creature in. As Abby looks over the side of the boat, the same mammalian face glares back up at her before vanishing. Just as Connor suggests they pack in the search, the same creature emerges and seizes Abby. Cutter leaps in to try and find her, and tells Connor to get help, and he summons boats and choppers to try and find Abby. Hours later, and they pause the search despite a distraught Connor's objections. Lester arrives and is quietly furious. He sends Connor home due to his emotional state, and Nick home for his disobedience, and refusal to tell others of what he was doing, putting Stephen in charge. Stephen maintains his stance that whatever it is must be in the canal, and commandeers an ROV to better search the area. We find out Abby is still alive, and she's stored in an old water treatment pipe with Lucien, both being guarded by the aquatic mammal in what seems to be a larder. Cutter hasn't actually left, and Jenny finds him but doesn't get him thrown out. Rather, she gives him a tip that a builder couldn't demolish a nearby warehouse due to a coincidentally flooded basement. Cutter rings Connor asking for help, and fully admitting his failings and responsibility as a leader, who unmute Connor. In the tank, the creatures continue to watch Abby and Lucien, as she keeps his morale up. Connor shows up to the warehouse to help Nick, albeit for Abby's sake, confessing the pettiness of their argument to Nick, who consoles him. The two start to get close to where Abby and Lucien are stored, but Abby is snatched before they arrive and get Lucien out. Connor rushes after Abby, and Cutter helps Lucien, who manages to get a pretty impressive knockout on one of the creatures that attacks them. Nick is then knocked into the tank by one of them, only for the ROV to emerge and distract the beast, which savages the camera. Stephen sees this from his boat and leaps in to help. The creatures are a future fictional species known as the mer, which are heavily derived and amphibious primates that now live much more like pinnipeds, though their initial ancestry can be seen in their expressive and baboon-like faces. Earlier I did a full video on them for you to check out as well, going into their speculative ecology. The ones we see so far are just the males, who are far more numerous than the titanic females. Connor finds Abby, but before they can reunite properly, they meet the Mer Queen herself, like a mix between a walrus and a gorilla, and she abducts Abby back through the anomaly and swats Connor away. Upon regaining consciousness, Connor brazenly follows them both through the anomaly. Lucien and Connor are now meanwhile surrounded by Mer, but Stephen shows up and guns them all down. On the other side of the anomaly, Connor arrives on a barren coastline lit by a stormy sky. He finds Abby, and tries to pull her up the rock face as the Mer Queen arrives, whilst also confessing his love for her. Stephen and Cutter arrive and gun down most of the offending Mer, before getting Abby and Connor back. Jenny is much more compassionate with Lucien than she was with earlier victims, and Lester arrives to plan sealing the whole warehouse under concrete, and to rub Stephen's nose in the fact he called it wrong too. At the flat, Connor realises how hard it is to reconcile with the things you said in a life and death situation, when the dice roll puts you in the former category afterwards. He fails to reconcile with Abby, and then leaves with Caroline for the theatre. We then check in with the soldier/cleaner, who is also in contact with League, who reprimands him for being seen, especially as it now turns out Helen is breathing down League's neck as well. Episode 5 opens in a brutalist housing estate, with troubled child Tyler, living under the dispassion of her wife-beater-wearing father. Taking their dog Sprat out for a walk, she inexplicably makes a beeline straight for an active anomaly, and Tyler follows her through into a stormy desert night. Tyler makes the accurate assessment they don't belong here, as Sprat is seemingly devoured by beasts in the sand. Connor's detector picks up the anomaly, but oddly seems to glitch out and crash. Running a few diagnostics, they find out spyware has been put on it to reroute its findings to another device. Connor and Cutter suspect the cleaner, but Cutter tells him to clean up the detector and find the anomaly, but tell no one yet. We see that it's League, and he sends the cleaner with other mercenaries through the same anomaly Tyler went through with capture gear. Back at the Ark, Jenny wows Cutter and Connor with her engagement party outfit, but bails on it when she finds out there's an anomaly. She claims it's any excuse to avoid her mother-in-law, but it does seem she's warmed up to the team considerably. On the other side of the anomaly, the mercs find Tyler. The cleaner insists they move on, but the rest of the team are unwilling to abandon a helpless child. The cleaner gets them moving anyway, but is deaf to Tyler's screams telling them to get off the sand, and she covers her ears as the same creatures from earlier launch their own assault on the mercenaries. Stephen gets home from a run and finds someone already in his shower. It's Helen, claiming she got slimed in the Devonian. She tries to drive a wedge between him and Nick, claiming that shady government officials and likely Lester are up to something. But Helen is really on the phone to League, who's getting anxious waiting for his team to get out. Cutter and Jenny arrive as Leek flees, and Spratt arrives from the anomaly alive and well. Steven arrives with Abby and Connor, and Connor tries to have a bro chat with Steven about Abby, concluding that honesty is important, something that strikes a chord with Steven. Connor busts out his entry to Robot Wars with a camera attached, and sends it through the anomaly. Sensors on it detect that it's a pre-carboniferous atmosphere, likely the Silurian. It also spots Tyler on her rock, and the team is perplexed as to why she's stuck there, when there's nothing really that dangerous in the time period. Cutter and Steven go through to fetch her, and encounter a swarm of millipede-like invertebrates that quickly rush by. It turns out they're fleeing from one of the sand predators. Back in the Anthropocene, Connor awkwardly stumbles towards a conclusion with Abby, dumping Caroline by text first. As Jenny checks in with Steve, who's now upset his stepchild is lost. Cutter and Steven find the mercenaries' specialist gear, with no tracks leading away from it. Cutter sees their fate through the recorded night vision, and Steven snaps at him, bringing up that someone in the Ark is a traitor, and tries to find out how much he knows. They go to find Tyler, and wind up getting marooned on her rock too, when the monsters in the sand chase them. She claims she doesn't need help, but lets them tag along anyway. One of the millipedes sneaks through the anomaly, and after Abby apprehends it in a restaurant ball pit and yeets it back through, the anomaly closes, with Cutter, Steven and Taylor stranded on the other side. With limited supplies and a low oxygen atmosphere, their chances are bleak. At the Ark, Connor and Abby are then reinstated to leadership roles, and the team will have to get by without Nick and Steven. Caroline receives Connor's heartless text and abducts Rex. In the Silurian, Taylor perks up and brings up cheerful topics like how long it'd take the sand beasts to eat them, who would be eaten first, and how good they'd taste to them. They spot a reflection on the hillside, and as they approach, they find the portable detector goes off. The anomaly has reopened, but a sandstorm buries the detector. Luckily, it's undamaged, but they're not the only ones after it. The cleaner approaches them, demanding the detector and all of their water. Nick tries to insist he take Taylor at least, but he shoots at Nick's feet as he tries to negotiate. He's grabbed from the sand, but claims he'll never talk as he's a professional, which must be why he's getting eaten. He's dragged completely under, and the rest can do nothing but continue their journey. Things are now more clear between Steven and Cutter. Steven's actor, James Murray, notes how since the cat of him sleeping with Helen is out of the bag, he's been more distanced from the rest of the team, and thus has fallen into Helen's arms and schemes a lot more easily. As such, he's become a lot more disillusioned with Cutter, his theories and his leadership. Murray somewhat jokingly calls him Thomas the Doubter. He also claims he's aware of Helen, what she's like, and that he has some awareness he may be being used, but said doubts are hard to overcome when she's reinforcing them. As they get close to the anomaly, Steven is grabbed. Taylor entices the beast to the surface, and we see it's a scorpion the size of a bus, with Steven stuck in its mandibles. Luckily, the smaller one is drawn to the surface too, and the pair fight, dropping Steven in the process. The smaller one is vanquished, as the three flee through the anomaly, wherever it may lead. The Silurian scorpions are probably behind the worms as one of the fruitier creations of Primeval for the show. The Paleozoic did have big scorpion-shaped animals, but these spent very limited amounts of time on land, and didn't reach the titanic sizes of the larger scorpions in Primeval. The Silurian ones are essentially big whip scorpions, or vinegaroons too. How they got so massive on a diet of millipedes and each other is unknown, as well as how their abundant and robust carapaces avoided the fossil record, as in the episode they are treated as a surprise, rather than something expected like the giant Arthroplora. Whilst the idea of the scorpions is excessive, some of their behaviours aren't so far off other invertebrates. Several species will use vibrations in the ground to hunt. Antlions in their pitfall traps use tiny hairs on their limbs to detect prey as it stumbles in. Real-life sand scorpions hunt on top of the sand, but instead use slit sensilla on their limbs to detect prey as it approaches them too. The Silurian scorpions may have the tail as their sensory organ, as we see it hover above the ground when the mercenaries try to capture it. The three arrive in what looks like a Holocene or Pleistocene forest and stumble across a Paleolithic camp. Before they can leave, its owner arrives. Nick thinks fast and punches the caveman out cold, who turns out to be an actor. At least they're back in the Anthropocene. Connor and Abby are relieved to have them back, and even Lester is too in his own frosty way. Taylor is returned to her stepdad, who promises to be a better parent, and everything seems to be wrapped up fairly nicely. Although later on at the Ark, the headset Nick took from the mercenaries is stolen in a moment from his desk, and returning to their flat, Connor and Abby find Rex has been taken too. Episode 6 opens with Lester's worst nightmare, a Colombian mammoth on the M25. Traffic halts as the beast goes berserk, flinging vehicles and trapping Mother Dina and her son Jake in their car. A kindly man tries to help them, but quickly winds up a casualty of the mammoth. At the Ark, Nick gathers a private meeting with his original three. They now all know that someone in the Ark is working against them, but they need to find out who it is before they act on it. The detector goes off, and the team mobilize, but Helen has snuck into the grounds of the Ark. She continues trying to insist it was Lester, and tries to win Stephen back to her side. He agrees to help, but Stephen insists they try to include Cutter in it, despite Helen's objections. Arriving at the motorway, Jenny has sealed everything down, and Nick is delighted to see a mammoth. But the beast is on edge, with Dina's panicked calls and beeping horn. Nick acts, and they manage to get Jake out as Abby rushes off to hatch a plan of her own. As Cutter frees Dina's trapped legs, her screams of pain antagonize the mammoth, which arrives and flips the car the two are in, and then threatens to crush it with them inside. Jake blares a lorry horn, and saves the two in the nick of time, as the mammoth turns its attention to them instead. Abby returns with a sprayer of female elephant urine, and after a promising plan to lure it back through the anomaly is scuppered when it closes, Nick improvises, and lures the mammoth into the back of the lorry. Mission accomplished. When arriving, Abby initially suggests that the social mammoth may be stressed by the lack of herdmates around, and elephant bulls do act as social buffers for one another that reduce negative interactions. But the mammoth bull is huge, and this occurs much more with older bulls to smaller ones. It's hard to imagine a larger and older individual than him. What's more likely is that it's in muths, the elephant mating period where bulls get a huge surge in testosterone and other sex hormones, and become very aggressive as a result. Fossil evidence shows that mammoths did undergo muths like modern elephants, and this fits the behaviour seen from the mammoth, as well as why it's so keen on the female elephant urine. Proboscideans also frequently hybridize, and there's evidence to suggest that Colombian mammoths did so with other species where their ranges overlapped. Elephant bulls aren't picky, and being another genus apart is of little concern to a muthsy mammoth. As the press descend, Jenny handles things, including one nosy reporter called Nick Harper, who's curiously insistent. This is the very least of their problems though, as Stephen brings Helen to see the team. He doesn't do a very good job of opening when he admits to continuing their affair, and Nick doesn't let things go further when he fires Stephen. Back at the Ark, the mammoth seems to have chilled out, despite Lester's suggestion of becoming an ivory poacher. Stephen tries to float the idea of going public with the anomalies, and fails to win over Abby, who is skeptical that humanity would treat the missing creatures adequately. He then tries to convince Cutter again, and does an even worse job, quickly making things personal and getting punched out by Nick. Cutter then summons Connor to the detector, and plants a virus on it to detect whoever has hacked their system, although Leek watches the whole thing. As the team leaves, he signs for a white van brought in, and in the back is one of their future predators, a mysterious red device on its forehead. Cutter, Abby and Connor lie in wait for the spy with a faked anomaly. Leek meets Caroline again, and she hands over Rex. She's aware he's up to something, and clearly some of Connor's gawky charm has worn off on her, as she's concerned what may happen to him. In the church, Jenny shows up, and a furious Nick confronts her, even pulling a gun on her. She reveals it was Leek who sent her, and that she was ordered to bring as many men to the location as possible, leaving the Ark deserted of armed personnel with the Predator, where Lester still is. Stepping out of his office, he notices how unusually empty the place now is. But like a haunted house, things still seem to rattle and move, as if still inhabited. No one answers his calls, and there's blood smeared over the labs. Leek hacks the detector, and reveals this really is all personal, and Leek just hates Lester so much, he's personally using the Predator to kill him. And so as the power cuts, a game of cat and mouse begins through the arc. Lester makes it to the gym, and briefly uses Abby's iPhone to confuse and deafen the Predator as he makes his way to the armory, where he seems surprisingly adept with a light machine gun to wound it and hold it at bay. Returning to the atrium, Lester unleashes the mammoth, and gets to return Leek's smug attitude to him, as the Predator leaps straight into the mammoth's tusks. As everyone else returns, they discuss events, and conclude Leek likely had a bigger plan in mind than just killing Lester. As they hack his account, it activates a bomb hidden in the van, though luckily Nick and Connor manage to defuse it. They examine the neural clamp on the future Predator, and its very advanced technology. The clamp controls the brain and nervous system via radio waves, and Connor traces the waves back to the source, with Lester deploying a team to find them. The main team decide to get Rex back in the meantime, tracking Caroline's number to a nearby abandoned warehouse, where they find Caroline's bag. As the two teams converge on their locations, Cutter and the others find Leek and his band of mercenaries and are kidnapped, whereas Lester arrives to a red herring. Helen kisses Nick awake as he comes to in a red-lit room with Leek and the others. The main lights come on, and the team find themselves in a creature prison, with all the assorted animals they'd faced from the past few months. In their next episode, we find out that after the display, the team have been put into cells. In theirs, Jenny and Cutter talk, and Jenny reveals that she's since separated from her fiancé. The job at the Ark is hard to mix with a social life, when you constantly have to keep rushing away, and he suspected infidelity. Nick slags off Leek, who is watching them with Helen, and as Leek seethes, Caroline is brought to the facility and quickly imprisoned with Abby and Connor. Connor quickly defends her, not putting two and two together, and realizing she was in league with Leek. Leek attempts a weird incel rapport with Connor, and Abby and Caroline have a girl fight until Connor breaks it up. This was 2007. At a seaside resort, a dodgy van pulls up and releases one of the Silurian megascorpions. With a beach full of noisy, warm-blooded prey, the beast is spoiled for choice. It takes its first victim, and then snacks on another man buried up to his neck, who can only watch its approach in panic. Lester rings Stephen, with no one else to turn to, and he agrees to help so long as he's alone. In the cells, Nick gets emotional about Helen, believing himself to still likely love her, and that they shared a unique bond, as Helen watches all of this over the CCTV. Helen brings the two from their cell, and is briefly fascinated to see Jenny, having spent some time with the original Claudia, before sending her to be with the rest, as she takes Cutter to the control room. Leek then also shows Caroline the creature prison, as well as how they're fed, and Helen shows Nick another one of Leek's neural clamped predators, confirming that the clamp technology is from the future as well. Helen wants to modify the past and present to see how it changes the future, and Nick is unimpressed. Leek then rings Lester, telling him to call off the search or he'll release another 12 creatures stationed at high-density population centres around the UK. Stephen mops up the scorpion at the beach without too much trouble, harpooning it in place for collection. Cutter gets Leek monologuing, finding out that Leek believes the anomalies will be a huge part of humanity's future, and wants the power that will come from having the most knowledge about them. Helen was happy to collaborate, wanting to do her own research on them too. Leek then releases the smileodon to where he left the rest of the team. Cutter and even Helen try to stop it, but Leek starts tweaking when anyone tries to give him an order, and has already gone power mad. Cutter breaks Leek's display, and when Leek patches his laptop to the mainframe, it spreads the virus Connor uploaded last episode. The team are free, but it also releases the creatures. Helen saves Nick from some of Leek's soldiers, and he reveals that he was well aware they'd be listening in, and told her everything she'd wanted to hear. Helen is unable to believe Nick isn't madly in love with her anymore, and escapes. She rings Stephen asking him to save her, and that claims Lester kidnapped her and killed the rest of the team. So a distraught Stephen rushes into action. While at the Ark, Connor's virus gives Lester access to all of Leek's plans. Leek, meanwhile, sends one of the clamped predators after Cutter, who steals himself and goes on the offensive, intimidating and deafening the predator with gunfire. The rest of the team find Rex, who is in the prison, who follows a draft and finds a way out. Jenny shoots someone dead, and Rex is wounded in the gunfire, with Caroline redeeming herself helping him out. With the rest of the team free, they summon Lester and his forces. Nick arrives in the same arena Leek used for his smileodon display earlier. Behind him, the predator keenly awaits. Nick allows it to approach within arm's length, distracting it with his own dripping blood, before tearing out its neural clamp and killing it. Leek shows up and isn't fazed, revealing he has an entire colony of them waiting, and now Nick as a bargaining chip against Lester. He calls him with this development, but Lester tells him they've mopped up his 12 creatures, and that he gave them the complete details of their operation. Leek then tries to use Cutter as hostage, but Lester doesn't budge. Cutter shoves the clamp he pulled off into a circuit box the Smileodon unhinged earlier, which disables all of them and returns the predators to factory setting, which is to say homicidal. Leek should have learned more about history, and like many Roman emperors, he meets his end by his own Praetorian Guard. Stephen arrives and quickly finds Helen. Helen wants to escape with Stephen, but the latter is full speed ahead on getting revenge, and trying to take down Lester. Helen is quickly busted when they find Nick, and her attempts to sway the others doesn't work, with them rather forcing her to come up with a solution. They use the feeding siren to lure all the creatures, past and future, to their feeding facility to be sealed in for good. A dromaeosaur quickly shows up and grabs Helen. Nick disables the door as Stephen shoots it dead, but now the feeding chamber has to be sealed from the inside. Cutter readies himself to do so, but Stephen punches him aside and does it himself. Cutter can only watch as the assorted carnivores circle Stephen, and he meets his end, as Helen quietly leaves. Sometime later, the surviving team assemble for Stephen's funeral. Nick accepts Jenny's offer of a drink, and before they head off to a new anomaly, he tears up the picture of him and Claudia, the last piece of her existence. Helen arrives to lay an ammonite shell on Stephen's grave, and it's now revealed she has an entire army of the cleaner soldiers seen earlier. I do regard Season 2 of Primeval as a little bit of a drop from the first, but still fairly solid overall. Whilst it did lack the mystery factor and novelty of the first that made it so intriguing, I think more characters just generally get a lot more to do in Series 2. Watching Stephen handle leadership and Helen's role in his story, Abby and Connor getting more drama, and the much stronger relationship between Connor and Cutter this time, with the former leaning on the latter much more in his fish-out-of-water state. Cutter himself is generally great as he was last time, although I think Helen is a much less interesting character from here on out. Helen being the complicated, emotionally neglectful and time-travelling wife is a much more deep and interesting angle than the one-dimensional sociopathic Time Lord villain she becomes. Although Juliet Aubrey would have been a great choice for the Rani if RTD ever did that. The whole Claudia-Jenny swap thing I thought was really good, the drama and acting surrounding it generally adding a fresh element to things. And Leek was also a nice addition. Carl Theobald doing a really good job playing a human weasel, desperately trying to make something of himself. The creatures and their episodes this time around are a mixed bunch. The dromaeosaur is generally made for a really strong start to things, and is one of the best episodes of the show, that really plays to Primeval's strengths of great creature scenes in the novelty of 2000s England. The raptors get a lot of screen time, look great, and were meant to have a full coat of feathers, but couldn't on a TV budget, so it can be forgiven. The worms and the scorpions, though, are some of the weaker creatures, and the second episode is also a bit of a slump for the series. Both get little screen time, presumably to save on budget, being obscured by fog or sand for most of it, and it just generally felt very unimpactful compared to the other creatures, as well as pushing the unbelievability a bit far. Neither of the two feel like they really make much sense. Episode 2 is obviously a very big Die Hard reference, and would have been served better by a creature that could actually utilise the skyscraper office setting a lot better than a literal worm. Episode 5 is easily better, but suffers from the fact a lot of the drama doesn't get to breathe in regards to the anomaly closing. The emotional dust had barely settled before another one opened, and if they'd had an episode gap between them, it would have hit a lot harder. Nick and Steven co-parenting Taylor was pretty funny though. The Smileodon episode is great, and it was a really nice touch to have it come from an old anomaly and be an escaped pet, and it's generally a well-paced and enjoyable episode. The Smileodon can be one of the jankiest CGI creations of the series, looking quite dodgy in some of the well-lit close-ups of the house attack, but when shot in the distance in the forest, it looked a bit better, especially some shots of it climbing the tree. The shot composition in the final assault was also quite memorable, especially the one shot of the Smileodon appearing and walking down the hallway to the vocal music. The mermaid for a strong episode 2, I thought, although I think it would have been nicer to dabble more in the future anomaly a bit longer, as it actually feels very undersold that they actually go forward in time. The Colombian mammoth is also just an overall excellent episode, and use of that creature too, that also may be one of the series' best. The finale is okay, essentially serving as her greatest hits of creatures, while delivering a good enough conclusion to the series. I think it does suffer a bit from melodrama, with the threat of escaped future predators and creatures in general being a bit oversold. But you can argue the characters were under a lot of stress when they said that. When trying to find promo images for the last Primeval video, I did find the reviews of Alex Morland, who asserted in their retrospective that Primeval was never really that good. Wrong, harsh, but also that it never managed to level its drama and emotions as successfully as contemporary shows. And I do think they had something of a point here, and part of it does come from the creatures after thinking about it. Unlike other sci-fi, dinosaurs have to be the subject over set dressing. In many instances of sci-fi, things like aliens and robots can be replaced with people, and you can still tell the same story, or at least get the same points across. Dinosaurs have a certain weight to them that commands a higher presence, and for the story to inherently revolve around them, with only really Dinotopia being the exception, which was a human drama with dinosaurs in the background, and some dinosaur characters. When taking the role, the cast of Primeval were notified they may be playing second fiddle to the special effects, at least some of the time. So the problem comes that when the story doesn't revolve around the creatures, it's battling them for screen time. Episode 4 of the first series succeeds as it combines the two, with the dodo-born parasite being the cause of Tom's death, which is also the main emotional thrust. It's also hard to have single 45-minute episodes that still have a nuanced and interesting story revolving around a creature, especially when it can't talk. You can have multiple episodes devoted to one creature, but then you risk losing roster diversity, which Primeval sells itself on to an extent. Primeval also isn't just a creature show. It often tried to be a time travel show, but this was also something that ultimately wound up getting lost in translation. Haynes mentioned that initially more people were intended to have been changed, like Claudia due to the anomalies, but this was cut, and Haynes essentially intended Helen to have been behind it, which is on brand. It's also odd that the future predator pups that survived at the end of Series 1 ultimately wound up not actually having any further impact on the story. In Season 3 they tried to have a limp shot at the person out of their time episode that ultimately falls a bit flat and wasn't done as well as other time travel shows, like that one episode with the same premise in Series 1 of Torchwood, one of the few good ones from that series. Again, both of these I think are ultimately symptoms of Primeval trying and not really succeeding at juggling different things, instead of just playing straight to its strengths. Monster of the Week is an underrated format, as I said last time, but there does come a point where you're going to risk treading the same ground, and for a series as high budget and CGI heavy as Primeval, that can't rely on a few contact lenses and a makeup job for a new opponent, you can't really waste episodes, or either have bottle ones, but at the same time I don't view Primeval as inherently doomed. I more think it'd just have to realign itself a bit. Primeval is from the 2000s, where things like climate change and the biodiversity crisis were simply not as on the radar as they are today. As such, it could occasionally fall into melodrama, trying to oversell the existential threat of what is just a big animal. If it ever came back, Primeval could work by highlighting things like human-wildlife conflict, with the creatures as exaggerated cinematic proxies for real-world events. There's that one image by Jacob Rosalski of the fisherman hunting the last mermaid that I think should be on every mood board ever, even if it's not for fantasy or sci-fi. And that Primeval could have a similar vibe, I think. With modern hindsight, you can make a lot of good strong points with the anomaly incursions, whilst maintaining Monster of the Week formats, satisfying both the need for a creature feature, but upgrading the potential strength of the writing too, outside of the same Monster Hunter situation. Thanks for watching, and thanks as ever to my patrons. Bonecrusher Hyena, Toxic Wolf, The Super Duper, DJ, My Best Friend Loba, Samburgo, K. Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, Phenomenon, The Belted Horned Warbler, Big Man Blastoise, Nathan Cross, Johnny, Oni, Tim Gojira, Teddy KGB, Waffle, Master 101, Dapper Raptor, Aristocrat Mojo, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Small Squid, Litton Gamer 111, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Dodecablos, and Bazukazu Bakumatsu, who help keep the channel going with their generosity. At long last, Primeval Series 2. Whilst the first video didn't do that well, who would have thought a near 20-year-old show with a cult following of millennial dino kids at best wouldn't get to 1 million views? I like the show, and it's my YouTube channel, so we have to talk about it. I will also do Series 3, and then probably stop at Series 3. Anyways, next time we'll be back to Monster Hunter for a round of broader topics, and hopefully I'll see you there for it.